Like many of us this week, our anticipation towards October 30th grows much like the beating heart of the force that palpitates in a galaxy far from our own. What of the child? What of the silent warrior? What of the merchandise?
I don't know about y'all, but I'm overwhelmed with excitement. I could argue that The Mandalorian is the best Star Wars content we've had in the past decade. I would count the sequel trilogy if my eyes didn't watch The Rise of Skywalker. Do not fight me on this. Now, is The Mandalorian squeaky clean, putting it amongst the best television of the past decade? Far from it. Here's a list of shows I recommend that are far better and more consistent than The Mandalorian, but that's not the point of this video, is it? The Mandalorian was an entryway for new fans of Star Wars and a re-entry for the older Star Wars fans. We could talk how The Mandalorian takes advantage of the 1970s sci-fi aesthetic it used in the original trilogy to launch older fans back to a time when they held their parents' or significant others' hands at the premiere of Star Wars in 1976 at their local Cinerama. We could also talk how the structure of the first season is simplified and the characters are accessible to a point where children understand what the heart of this universe is. It's Baby Yoda. Just kidding. It's adventures in space! It's exploration. It's fun characters that have room to grow with them. It's fun again. And to be honest, that's kind of all that we wanted. For myself, I remember watching Force Awakens and having a blast. It was sure a hodgepodge of A New Hope with a facelift, but it had potentially new, interesting characters with humor and room to grow into well-defined, characters. So, when the sequel trilogy inevitably wrapped and the game of directorial hot potato finally fell back into the hands of J.J. Abrams, he had the monumental task of completing the Skywalker saga. While divisive to the masses, for myself, it was a movie that took no risks, and because of that, it was a failure in my eyes. Be that as it may, I understand that many audience members just wanted a conclusion that satisfied their needs. There's nothing wrong with that, but I had different sets of expectations, and I believe that's also okay. You can put the gun down, Jeremy. I hope there's a Jeremy watching that's freaking out right now. Moving back to October in 2018, Disney Plus had announced that The Mandalorian had begun production. And although casting had been announced leading up to their shooting, the tone of the series was somewhat mysterious. Brief mentions from showrunner and director Jon Favreau had hinted that the series would be inspired heavily by the spaghetti westerns of the 1960s, with even stronger roots in the samurai films of the 1950s, which in fact inspired the Sergio Leone spaghetti western genre. The lone, quiet nomad pitted against an evil, greedy power in films like Yojimbo, which arguably inspired A Fistful of Dollars, or a group of unlikely ragtag heroes tasked to rile up the spirits of a small rural town and inspired them to fight back against an oppressive presence in Seven Samurai. Traces of Japanese cinema can be found all over Star Wars, and look no further than the father of what makes Star Wars iconography, editing, tropes, and character, renowned filmmaker Akira Kurosawa.
I grew up in a small town, Central California, and the movie theaters there didn't show much beyond Bridge on the River Kwai and The Blob. So I didn't really experience foreign films until I found my way into film school. And at that point is when I was actually exposed to Kurosawa. And a friend of mine, John Milius, actually was a huge fan of Kurosawa's. And so whenever the film was showing, he'd say, "Oh, you gotta come and see this, you gotta come and see this." And after the first one, the first one I saw was Seven Samurai, and after that I was completely hooked. I said, this is really good.
As a way of honoring the filmmakers that came before them, Star Wars continued in that legacy of borrowing these trademarks of character, of storytelling, and most of all, culture. Kurosawa's samurai epics of the 1950s became widely recognized on an international level, reaching the shores of America with Rashomon in 1950, followed by his most notable film, Seven Samurai, in 1954. However, up to the late 40s, Kurosawa was a recognizable name within his country of Japan, but his heart and inspiration for film came from America. Whether it was his goal to reach an American audience, his films prior to the 50s had been criticized as being too American for Japanese audiences at the time. His fascination with American films came from his elder brother Heigo Kurosawa, who was one of his greatest inspirations. As well as his brother, Akira's film inspiration would stem from his childhood interests. His fascination in education and calligraphy and kendo, along with his father's Isamu Kurosawa's encouragement to indulge in these American films, heavily molded Akira's style of filmmaking. Isamu's samurai lineage would also add to Akira's repertoire as a filmmaker, reinvigorating an interest to wider audiences in the heritage of the way of the samurai, which at the time had long been lost in time after the Meiji era. Kurosawa's ingenuity in shot composition would soon become second to none, inspiring many other directors, as well as his fascination in samurai culture that, through cultural osmosis, found its way into the modern era. The Mandalorian came as a surprise to many people, expecting an Obi-Wan series far before we got a standalone series that centers around a faceless bounty hunter and his Shia bit. Put the gun down, Jeremy! I also love me some... the child. That sounded wrong. Baby Yoda. Much better. However, upon its release on November 2019, it became an instant hit that, in my honest opinion, was a show that, on a weekly basis leading up to the premiere of The Rise of Skywalker, overshadowed my anticipation for the last film in the Skywalker saga. So, who would have known? Now, was it a sleeper hit? Hell no. But it did what many other Star Wars films and series tried to do, make Star Wars exciting again. But what does that have to do with Kurosawa? Well, most people probably already know the foundation upon which Star Wars was built is Kurosawa's filmography, but the way of the samurai known as Bushido, dating back to the 1600s, would become the basis of the hero archetype that this series is built upon, as well as many other fictional works of art. Author Yuko Mishima defines Bushido as someone who has a firm sense of self-respect, takes responsibility for his action, and sacrifices himself to embody that responsibility. Now, you could definitely argue that you could swap the concept of Bushido for chivalry, which means the basic self-respect by respecting others, a moral code in which anyone who's worth their skin can live by, but for the sake of consistency, we will hone in on Bushido. The Jedi are a somewhat nomadic group of people that adopted a lifestyle in the pursuit of becoming warriors sought to protect. In some ways, they are the samurai of space, honoring Bushido with a touch of magic. But now we have The Mandalorian, a show that thankfully acts as a derivative to the Jedi narrative that has driven Star Wars as a franchise up to this point. A drifter who somewhat still obeys a code, but not one of the Jedi, but one that represents a faction of people who have been abandoned or orphaned by the war in Star Wars. The Mandalorian that we've grown to love could be considered a Ronin. No, not that one. Now, many argue that Kinji Misumi's Lone Wolf and Cub film series is the foundation for The Mandalorian since they bear so many similarities. For example, episode 1 of The Mandalorian ends with the introduction of the child in a floating pod, which its iconography parallels Lone Wolf and Cub, a story of an assassin for hire wandering feudal Japan while wheeling his 3-year-old son in a cart. For the most part, I definitely agree. As someone who hasn't seen those movies myself, I can't 100% say they are one-to-one, but I can say off the premise it sounds similar enough. However, I believe that the romanticism of The Mandalorian being a Ronin is so present in the storytelling that Favreau and his team of directors brought every week. The Mandalorian code based on the series is a way of adopting a code of killing your former life and adopting a new way of life. What that life entails, based on season 1, is left to the imagination or canon. Mando represents that Ronin quality since whatever principles and way of life he had died along with his family. In samurai culture, if you don't commit seppuku or ritualistic suicide when your master dies, you are a Ronin, an outcast. The Mandalorian culture is a culture of cultureless. It's a collection of broken people either forcibly or voluntarily outcast. In essence, The Mandalorian and Star Wars represents that melting pot of Western and Eastern cultural influences. Much like the Mandalorian people, Star Wars has taken identity of its own by adopting these different influences and creating a brand new culture. The Mandalorian happens to follow in that legacy while continuing to borrow concepts used in Misumi and Kurosawa's works. And yes, I know that Lone Wolf and Cub is based off a manga, but these are just the details, baby. Japanese cinema has as much of an influence on American pop culture as American pop culture has had vice versa. It's through this lens that Star Wars has always thrived on. The idea of a morally grounded character that has to make decisions that questions their beliefs. It's a tale as old as time, and Star Wars was the vehicle for introducing those concepts into an era where old beliefs had to be remembered. In a time where fan outcries had become powerful enough to will a film into existence, The Mandalorian stands as a prime example of how to make the old feel new without feeling rehashed or unoriginal. Like mentioned earlier, episode 1 through the season finale feels like it's directly inspired by Misumi's Lone Wolf and Cub series, while episode 4, Sanctuary, is directly inspired by Kurosawa's Seven Samurai, as well as Mando's characterization being a blend of Zatoichi, Yojimbo, and Clint Eastwood's character in the Man with No Name trilogy. In essence, The Mandalorian, or Star Wars in general, has always been that perfect cocktail of American Western and Japanese samurai cinema that we haven't been able to get enough of since 1976. While Lucas was inspired by the Flash Gordon serials with swashbuckling action in outer space, the hints of his adoration for Kurosawa's work still resonate today and continue to be seen in what is now a cultural hit with The Mandalorian. Will Season 2 live up to the first? Well, I hope it far exceeds Season 1, don't you? While there are certain episodes that feel hokey and certain episodes that are bafflingly hard to get through, the tone of the show is consistent and captures the spirit of what made the original trilogy so appealing. Fundamentally, it needs to be built on the foundation that made it. A samurai western in space with memorable characters and a singular vision with different eyes on the same prize. If you get that right, I can't imagine you can go wrong, because
this is the way.
Thank you guys so much for watching. If you guys have made it this far, give yourself a pat on the back. It was really fun to make this video, and I'm really excited for The Mandalorian. I am posting this video a little bit later than I wanted to, but I thought might as well get it out there, so it should be releasing the day of release, but not at the very, very moment of release. So the first episode of the second season will be out already. But anyways, guys, I hope you enjoyed it. Click like, and obviously subscribe if you haven't, and yeah. Expect more videos in the future, and as always, I will see you later.